Anthony Lee. We are so happy to have you, Dr. Anthony Lee. I'm going to give a short introduction and then we're going to get started. So, Dr. Anthony Lee is a retired professor of African and African American history who taught most recently at UCLA and West Los Angeles College. He has published a number of books and papers on the history of the Baha'i faith in Africa and in Iran. He is co-owner of Kalimat Press, a small independent Baha'i publishing company. He is also a poet who, with the late Amin Banani, translated the poems of Tahirih and has published 5 other books of poetry in English and in English translation. So today, our topic, it is the African presence at the genesis of the Baha'i faith. A very interesting one indeed. Baha'i history has paid too little attention to the Africans who were present in the household of the Bab at the beginning of the Baha'i era. This presentation will discuss the roles that Haji Mubarak and Fezzeh Khanum, 2 African servants of the Bab, played in the early days of the Baha'i faith. From the first night of the Bab's revelation on the evening of May 22nd, 1844, Haji Mubarak witnessed and participated in the development of this new faith. Fezzeh Khanum remained the companion of Khadijih Bagum, the Bab's wife, until the end of her life. Some materials have been provided for study before this class. You can still find them online. They're titled The Ethiopian King by Nader Saiedi and Half the Household Was African by Anthony Lee, our speaker. So again, if you can, go to www.clearwaterbaha'is.org and you'll find these links to these papers that you can also download and read. So with that being said, Anthony, how are you?
Thank you. Very good.
We had some trouble getting online today this morning, but Jeremiah, as always, pulls us through, right?
Yes, well, that's normal with Zoom. There's always a glitch somewhere.
Always. So we are ready for your presentation. It's all yours from here.
Oh, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. I don't know if people can see me, but here I am. I think there are enough people, a few enough people that we can be very informal. So I'm okay with everybody unmuting themselves. And if you have questions or you want to interrupt anything I'm saying, please go ahead and do it. And ask your question right in the middle of everything, and I will respond to it. That's fine with me, so don't be shy. I'm going to talk just for a few minutes, 20 minutes or so, half hour, about the 2 slaves, actually, who were in the household of the Bab. One is Haji Mubarak, who was a man, of course, and who is known in the dawnbreakers in the Baha'i world as the Ethiopian servant of the Bab. And the other one is Fezzeh Khanum, who came into the Bab's household as a very young girl of 6 or 7 years old, and remained the companion of the Bab's wife until the end of both of their lives, actually. So both of them are briefly dealt with in this book, Black Pearls, which was published by Kalimat Press. And unfortunately, right at this minute, is no longer available, though I'm trying desperately to get it reprinted. Though I do have an electronic copy of the book. If anybody wants it, I'll be happy to send it to them for free. I mean, and it covers a number of the Black servants and slaves that the author, Abu Hazem Afnan, who was a relative of the Bab, he grew up in the Bab's family, of course, and all of these slaves and servants were in the household at all times. So he wrote this book and wrote down his memories, which is a great service for us because it gives us a lot of information about these African actors. All right, let's talk about Haji Mubarak. If you have seen Nader Saiedi's paper, The Ethiopian King, which is available here, you know that Dr. Saiedi, who is a Baha'i and a professor at UCLA and is teaching classes on the Baha'i faith, on the Baha'i writings, and on Baha'i history, he was asked by the House of Justice a few years ago to come and survey all of the body of the writings of the Bab that are collected in Haifa, which is not everything, of course, but is a huge amount. And he did, and through this survey of reading everything that was available, he made some discoveries which were quite astonishing. And one of them concerned the Bab servant, Mubarak, who Baha'i history has not paid a great deal of attention to, actually. He is known in, he is known in the Dawnbreakers as the Ethiopian servant of the Bab, but he's not even named in the Dawnbreakers. He kind of goes nameless. And he is given some credit for taking oral messages back and forth among the letters of the living, but then he kind of disappears. That's about it. Except for Mr. Afnan's book, we don't get much more information about the Bab. What Dr. Saiedi discovered was a tablet, or several tablets of the Bab, actually, in which he identifies Haji Mubarak as his caretaker after the death of his father. You might know that the Bab's father died when he was very young, about 6 years old, and he was placed in the care of his uncle. And he has many, many tablets in which he prays for and praises his mother and his father. And then he always includes, after mention of his mother and his father, he always includes, and the one who raised me, the one who cared for me, the one who brought me up. And everyone simply assumed before Nader's research that this referred to the Bab's uncle, in whose household he was living and who was responsible for his care. But what Nader found was, in one case, the Bab prays for his father and his mother and the one who raised me. And then he adds, whose name is Mubarak. Well, this was a surprise, a complete shock, actually, that he is praying for, on the same level with his mother and his father, he's praying for his African nanny, who was actually a slave in the household of his uncle. And he has very high praise for him. He thanks him for making bows and arrows for him when he was a child that he could play with, and so on. So he has very high affection for him. Then, as it happens, when the Bab was married, his uncle actually sold this servant to the Bab for, I forget, 29 tomans or something. Wasn't a large amount of money, but he followed the Bab into his new household, and his wife brought with her young child, Fezzeh, who was also an African slave and who remained her companion. Now, the Bab was not very wealthy. His house was very, very small, and he was rather dependent on his relatives, and he eventually retired from business. He was a merchant, buying and selling, and he devoted himself entirely to his religious exercises, his prayers and devotions, and was supported by his uncle and his wife's family. So Mubarak apparently was very well known to the Bab, had raised him, and had continued to serve him in his new household. That wasn't known before, and that places a new emphasis and value and importance on Mubarak, who now can be seen as one of the major figures in the Bab's life. Now let's fast forward to the night of the declaration of the Bab, where Mubarak shows up again. Fezzeh at this point is still a very young child, but I am assuming now that all of you know the story of Mullah Hossein arriving in Shiraz in search of the Promised One, and he is met by the Bab, who appears to know him, and invited to the Bab's house. And Mullah Hossein was a little reluctant to go, but he followed the Bab there. Went to his house. They said the evening prayers. They had a meal together served by Mubarak. And during that conversation, which lasted all night long, the Bab revealed himself as the Promised One to Mullah Hossein, and Mullah Hossein accepted him. This is the night of the declaration of the Bab, the evening of May 22nd, 1844, which is the beginning of the Baha'i era. And the Bab fixed, strangely enough, the exact moment of the beginning of his revelation at 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset on the evening of May 22nd, 1844. And that apparently is the moment that Mullah Hossein, maybe he didn't even realize it, but the moment that Mullah Hossein recognized the station of the Bab and became the first believer. And that is the moment where the Bab fixes his revelation, the beginning of his revelation. This might also be symbolic because the numbers 2, which represents the letter B, which is the first letter of the Quran, and so on, and the number 11, which is the number of the word Hova or Howa, which means he, which represents God. Maybe that was a symbolic gesture on the part of the Bab. But anyway, nonetheless, every year Baha'is around the world at 2 hours after sunset commemorate, often with the tablet of visitation, this moment as the beginning of the Baha'i era, as the opening of a new era in human history, as the beginning of the Bab's religion, and so on. And it's fascinating that Mullah Hossein is there and is regarded as the first believer, and the Bab fixes the beginning of his faith, not with his first revelation. This is true of Baha'u'llah also, by the way. but with the beginning of the faith of the first believer. So he sees the revelation as a conversation between the prophet of God and the believer. And that conversation began at 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset. And the symbolic idea is that you can't have religion without believers, of course. And so here we have the first believer. Now we know that story very well. The important thing to realize is that there were other people there in the room who were witnessing and participating in this event. And though Nabil in the Dawnbreakers kind of ignores them, nonetheless, we know from other sources that the Bab's wife, Khadijih Khanum, told this story quite often, that she was told by her husband that is the Bab, that he was going to have an important visitor, and he asked her to retire without him and he would entertain the visitor. And she said she did. She went to her room, but it was a very tiny house. She could hear everything that was going on, and she didn't go to sleep. And she says, and has passed down orally, and it was written down in the book Khadijih Bagum by Mr. Balyuzi, I believe, that she heard everything that was going on in this conversation between Mullah Hossein and the Bab, and understood the beginning of the revelation. She even says that before that, she had seen the Bab in his prayers and believed in him and recognized him. So we have a woman present at the scene. And also we have an African slave, actually, who is there. This is Haji Mubarak, who was serving tea and dinner and so on to the two actors here, the major actors, Mullah Hossein and the Bab. And he may have even been in the room. Well, he certainly was in the room during part of the conversation, but at the moment of 2 hours and 11 minutes after sunset, even if he wasn't in the room, his room was right next door, and he certainly didn't retire for the night while his master was awake and entertaining a guest. So he was there. He also heard this moment, and should be included in our sacred history as a participant in this seminal place, the seminal moment in the history of the Baha'i faith and in the history of the world, really. For Baha'is, this ends the prophetic cycle and begins a whole new cycle of human history. Now, we can understand that Nabil wasn't paying much attention to women and slaves in his history, and he doesn't throughout the entire history. He never gives much attention, even to Tahirih, actually, because it wasn't considered proper to talk about women during that period. It wasn't considered right to discuss the Bab's household, his wife or his slaves. Nonetheless, we can see historically that they were both there. And when we tell this story, we should include them as being full participants in this important, important doesn't quite cover it, does it? This profound moment in Baha'i history, that this included at the genesis of the Baha'i faith, both a woman and an African. So that Africans were right there at the beginning and participated in the great announcement, so to speak. We know that Haji Mubarak, besides raising the Bab, was literate. He was a Muslim. He had converted to Islam. And that the Bab had, when he wound up his affairs, he had entrusted Mubarak with the job of settling his accounts and paying his debts and collecting from his creditors and so on to finish his business, which means that Mubarak must have been not only literate, but he was also familiar with the traditional accounting systems that were used, that were very complicated and required special knowledge. The Bab also, when he, shortly after the declaration, went on pilgrimage, brought with him only two people. One was Qudus, of course, who was the last disciple and in many ways the most important disciple of the Bab. And he was chosen to come with him to Mecca, where he was going to make his declaration right at the center of Islam, which he did. Eventually, nobody paid any attention, of course, but he was there. And he brought with him Mubarak. Mubarak was kind of used as a secretary, because during this entire trip, the Bab was revealing prayers and tablets and treatises and so on, and it just kind of flowed out from him. And Mubarak was taking them down and preserving them in writing. So he was quite literate and quite capable. There is also this incident where on the pilgrimage, an Arab thief kind of rushed into their camp as the Bab was saying his prayers and grabbed the saddlebags and ran off. They were simply filled with the Bab's writings. And Mubarak was ready to get on a horse and go after him, and the Bab prevented him. So he was very trusted, and he was a part of the Bab's life. When the Bab returned to Shiraz, he was arrested and placed under house arrest. He was not allowed to see anyone, but there was his house was attached to his uncle's house, and there was a secret passage that nobody knew about, where guests and pilgrims and believers could come secretly to meet with the Bab. And it was Mubarak who kept this secret and was guiding the pilgrims in to see the Bab. Eventually, the Bab was banished from Shiraz and never returned. And Mubarak never saw him again, and neither did his wife or his mother. He was exiled. Well, everybody knows the story. He was imprisoned in the north of Iran and eventually executed. Mubarak remained in the household of the Bab and was supposed to care for the Bab's wife and mother. Eventually, because of the Bab's execution and the whole upheaval in Iran, it became impossible for the Bab's mother to remain in Shiraz, and Mubarak, she wanted to leave the country, actually, because of the sort of deprecations of her relatives who showed nothing but hostility. And Mubarak, she couldn't go alone because of the customs of the time, where women were simply not allowed to travel by themselves. So they had to be accompanied by a male relative or a slave in this case. So he accompanied her to Karbala, where he cared for her until his death. in Karbala. All right, so that's the story, the value, the importance of Mubarak. Fezzeh remained a companion of the Bab's wife and suffered all of the persecutions of that the Bab's wife had to go through during this time. The Bab's wife remained in the house of the Bab. Baha'u'llah wanted her to live there, even though the house had been attacked and almost destroyed. It was restored, and Khadijih Bagum went back to live in the house, and so did Fezzeh. And that house became a point of pilgrimage for the Babis and later the Baha'is, and remained a point of pilgrimage. And everyone would go to the house to hear Khadijih Bagum tell her story and explain her life with the Bab, which lasted only a couple of years, actually. But nonetheless, it became sort of a shrine for Baha'is, and still is, and was destroyed, of course, by the Islamic Republic, but we hope one day will be rebuilt. Fezzeh Khanum was there the entire time and received the pilgrims, cooked for them, served them, and was part of the story, of course, because she had met the Bab also. Mr. Afnan told me that the pilgrims who went to the house of the Bab would kiss Fezzeh's shoulder as a sign of respect and subordination because she had seen the Bab. Now, unfortunately, none of this is written up in our traditional Baha'i histories, understandably, because of the the culture of the time. But what I am suggesting and arguing, and have argued many times in print and elsewhere, that it's time for us to modernize this and to admit Fezzeh and Haji Mubarak to our sacred history as a way of understanding the full implications of the unity of humanity, that the Bab's declaration included not only a literate and educated Muslim man who was Mullah Hussein, but also included an African slave and a woman who are part of our of the genesis of our faith and should be understood to have been present at that moment and participated in it along with Mullah Hussein. Now, because of the customs of the time, of course, they couldn't do much. Obviously, the Bab's wife had to remain veiled and in her house. And the Bab's slave, actually, Haji Mubarak, had to remain in his place. But nonetheless, today we can recognize the value and importance of these two actors in Baha'i history. Now, everybody remembers you can interrupt me, right? I've been going on and on for a while. I'm happy to have somebody chime in here.
So we do have a question from Catherine, Florida.
Okay.
Yeah, Catherine.
Yes. This has kind of floored me because you have mentioned and you have been very upfront about the fact that these were slaves.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, can we understand slavery in the time of the Bab as a parallel to chattel slavery here in the United States? And how the other thing is that many of our African-American friends, especially a seeker, might be put off by the idea that the Bab owned slaves.
Sure, I understand that, and that's a question that has arisen many times. No, slavery in Iran was not comparable to the plantation slavery in the United States. we're talking about domestic slavery here as opposed to plantation slavery. I mean, these are slaves that are brought into the household and are almost junior members of the family. We can see here that Mubarak, for instance, raised the Bab as his, what do we call it, nanny or something. And the Bab praises him constantly in his writings and prays for him, and actually equates him, I mean, puts him on par with his own parents, so that every time the Bab mentions his father and then his mother, he also mentions Mubarak in the same breath. So he, in one of his writings, says that in this revelation, the kings have been brought from the highest station to the lowest station, and the servants or the slaves have been elevated to the station of kings, so that he calls, and in his writings he actually designates Mubarak as the Ethiopian king. Yeah, Americans might have trouble with this. I did send a picture of an art installation in the Baha'i Center in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, in which it shows somebody has created a sculpture or an installation which shows Mubarak at the door of the Bab's house inviting Mullah Hussein and the Bab in for the first time. And the Ethiopians seem to be quite happy to accept Mubarak as an actor at the beginning of the revelation, because they have this right in their Baha'i Center. I don't know if this, I sent the picture. I don't know if everybody has access to it, but I can send it again. I think we have to understand slavery in a different way. Slavery was a domestic necessity for any wealthy or even middle class Iranian family at the time, because of the seclusion of women, which was also a necessity for middle class and upper class families. These are histories of oppression which are universal in the world, but let's talk about the Iranian example, where women were supposed to be veiled. They were not supposed to go outside of their house except maybe to the house of a relative or something. And therefore, there had to be somebody who was going to take care of the business of the household, the shopping and, you know, various other necessities for the household. And so every household had to have a slave. I have studied slavery in Iran and published a number of articles about it. Most of the slaves brought to Iran were women, actually, who were brought there for domestic service and also for concubinage, of course. This was all domestic slavery. There was no plantation slavery in Iran. They were not used for agriculture or anything.
Is there any record about why he was a slave? Was it like payment of a debt? I know, especially in other places, sometimes this would happen, that the family would owe money, and so therefore they would sell the child into servitude in order to pay for the debt.
Yeah, that did happen, but this is part of the African slave trade. There was an Atlantic slave trade, which we know about, in which 10 or 12 million slaves were brought across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. There was also an Indian Ocean slave trade. It was not quite as large, but maybe over 100 years or so, about 2 million slaves, maybe 3 million slaves were sold over the Indian Ocean to Arabia, to Iran, to India, and to Indonesia, and China even. So there was a slave trade, that's my field, on the Indian Ocean, mostly of women again, sold not for labor, well, domestic labor, I guess, but maybe 2/3, 3/4 of these slaves were women. The others were normally eunuchs who were castrated in Africa and then also sold for domestic service so that they could serve in the household without there being any scandal. They could be in the women's quarters. So Mubarak, we have no idea how Mubarak was brought to Iran except as a part of this Indian Ocean slave trade. Now, these slaves in Africa were basically rounded up either in war as prisoners and then sold, or kidnapped, or brought to the coast from the interior of Africa, normally sold out of Zanzibar Island.
Doctor, yeah, maybe
please go ahead.
Yeah, I think maybe for myself, what I would, I think as a Baha'i, what I understand is that there were conditions at the time that the central figures did not create, but were forced to accede to because of circumstances. For example, Baha'u'llah had 3 wives.
Yes. Well, and also the women had to be veiled, and they
and then there were all kinds of things. He didn't buy Mubarak. Mubarak was bought by his father, his uncle. And the fact that there was, he bought Mubarak, but he didn't buy it in the sense of on a market. The fact he was actually transferring ownership when the sale took place, he was protecting Mubarak by keeping him in his household.
Well, yeah, I mean, he knew Mubarak from childhood, and this was his closest companion. And of course, when he was married, he followed him into his household. There was a formal sale, but I think that was just a formality. And he was brought into the Bab's household as he had lived with him all his life. You're absolutely right that there were social conditions that the Bab could not simply erase, including the seclusion of women, including, slavery, including the general conditions of society, which his revelation was intended to overturn, but not instantly. We're still trying to overturn those conditions, actually.
Would it be fair to say, however, because it sounds almost as if you're saying because they were domestic or household slaves, it was a better deal than working in the fields. And, maybe the labor was not quite as difficult, but the point still remains that they were slaves, whether they were doing domestic work or any other type of work. And we should acknowledge that. Even if it was still in keeping with the customs of the time, and we can put it in that context and understand it, these were still people who did not have the freedom to come and go and do as they wish, and could be traded or given to another person.
Yeah, we absolutely must recognize that. But at the same time, women were in exactly the same position. They were not free to come and go. They didn't have their own, lives. They were under the control of their fathers or husbands or brothers or uncles, and so on. I mean, we're dealing with a society where freedom is not an issue because nobody was free. Freedom was not a possibility. As a matter of fact, it would make you completely vulnerable to anybody who came along. This is a society in which you had to have a protector who was Muslim, first of all, and who was wealthy and powerful. And if you didn't have a protector of that kind, you better find one, because you would immediately be either killed or enslaved.
For an example, she was a woman. She gets killed. She doesn't have protection anymore, and she gets killed.
Who is that, Tahirih, you mean?
Tahirih, yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, she no longer was under the protection of her husband or her father. Baha'u'llah tried to protect her at some point. And then once she lost that protection, then she could be killed with complete impunity. I also have in my research, this is a little off to the side, but there is an example I came across of two African women who were sisters and who were enslaved and were purchased. This has nothing to do with the Baha'i faith, but they were purchased in Mecca on a slave market by a wealthy man who was returning to Arabia. On the way back to Arabia, their master died. And suddenly they had, not only were they free, but they had access to all of his money. And they continued their journey and were trying to get back home to Africa. They went to a port city of Basra at the southern tip of Iraq, but they had no protectors. And within a very short time, somebody just came along and re-enslaved them, took their money. And what are they going to do? Call the police? I mean, there aren't any police. There's no such thing. And, you know, unless you have somebody to protect you, you're just at the mercy of whoever wants to come along. So even, you know, slavery was not abolished legally in Iran until 1928. Up until that point, people were legally held as slaves in Iranian households. And after that point, let's say in 1928, we have records of people complaining that they have been thrown out of the houses that they lived in all their lives with their children and just put out on the street by Iranian families because the family just wanted to get rid of them. And they're complaining to the authorities that they, you know, that they should be supported and protected by their family. It's a completely different society. It's hard for us to even imagine a society where you have no rights, you have no law, besides religious law, of course.
I like to add something.
Sure.
I like to add something. If my mom was alive, would be more than 100 years old, from Yazd, Iran. And she said when she was a little girl, they had an African American lady. In fact, her name was Fezzeh also. But they never refer to her as any way she's bad or she's black or nothing. They loved her like auntie, but it was very customary in those days that families had some other people to come help because the wife alone could not do all day long cleaning or cooking those days style and taking care of children. So sometimes they had even more than one. That didn't have to be black. It was from villages, was from when, in my time, when we went to summer vacation, believe me, families came, asked us, begged us to take their young girl or boy with us because they couldn't feed them. So we would
and you can imagine the oppression.
Send them to school, teach them to read and write, and kind of being raised with us. It really was not a matter of what you call it, as you call it, the way it has ever been here. Never. Very friendly. My mom always talked about Fezzeh and how much she loved it. And when she got sick,
you have to recognize that this is a consequence of horrific oppression, not only of African slaves, but also of Iranian peasants. Can you imagine the condition of a family that is willing to give away their children to strangers who were just on vacation in order to give them a better life? I mean, this is horrible, horrific. Now, if they're brought into a kind Baha'i family, they might be taught to read and write and raised and educated and so on. But that entirely depends on the family that they were given to, as they might be under terrible conditions. No, we can't apologize for slavery. Slavery everywhere in the world was a terrible condition of oppression and isolation. But at the same time, we have to recognize that slavery was universal. It's known in every society in the world. It wasn't even questioned until the middle of the 19th century. So that every society, traditional, Chinese, Indian, Iranian, African, whatever, had slavery. And this slavery was oppressive. And slaves could be in better or worse situations, but they were not, well, nobody was free, but they were attached to an owner. Let's put it that way. Baha'u'llah also owned slaves and freed them, very famously. He has tablets, letters of manumission in which Baha'u'llah establishes the principle that we are all slaves to God and that he can't own slaves because he is a slave, and he gives his freedom to his slave. And then later in the Kitab Aqdas, of course, he completely forbids the buying and selling of slaves. But you will notice that even in the Kitab Aqdas, Baha'u'llah does not command the Baha'is to suddenly turn their slaves out into the street, because that would be impossible. He does say that there can no longer be buying and selling of slaves, which would eventually, of course, have the effect of abolishing slavery altogether.
Well, there's a question from Jackie Newberry. She wanted to know if she doesn't want to talk. So
okay.
Me for her. She wants to know about Nabil and whether he was of African descent. She heard something along those lines and would like to have clarification.
Not that I know of. No, Nabil is not of African descent. He was a companion of Baha'u'llah and, of course, the writer of the Dawnbreakers. And Baha'u'llah asked him to write a history of the faith, and he did. Now, African descent is another question because, as I said, every household that could afford it, every middle class or upper class household in Iran had slaves. Generally, these slaves were women. And they were also used for concubinage, which is to say that according to Muslim law, the owner of a slave, the male owner of a slave, has sexual access to his slaves if he wants to. And according to Muslim law, again, Sharia, the child that is born of a slave by her master is born free, and that child has equal rights to inheritance to all of the master's other children born by his other wife or wives. So that it's quite different than the American system where the children of a slave are automatically slaves. Quite the opposite. If the master has a child by his slave woman, then that child is born free and will inherit from his father. And generally these fathers are wealthy, of course. So when the slave does inherit, let's say he has a son, this son is going to have a pile of money and will have no trouble of finding a wife who is from the same class. So the upper classes, at least in Iran, were very mixed with African genes, so to speak. And you can see in Iranian families the physical traits of Africans. I mean, the curly hair and the nose and the skin color and so on. So that most, many, let's say, Iranians have African ancestors. It's quite common. They're generally not acknowledged because nobody wants to acknowledge that their mother or grandmother was a slave. But nonetheless, it is possible that Nabil had African ancestors as well. But I have no evidence of that.
Yeah, and you spoke about Baha'u'llah. It's a very interesting concept that Baha'u'llah, he wrote a tablet, and Nader Saiedi believes it was written to the slave named Isfandiyar, held by Baha'u'llah's father, and then freed by Baha'u'llah himself. And Baha'u'llah wrote this historically significant tablet at a very early date before the Bab's declaration. And this tablet, one of the earliest surviving writings of Baha'u'llah, it is one of the world's earliest emancipation proclamations. And Baha'u'llah is also mentioned, apparently Jackie Newberry is bringing this point up, that there are two books by Muslim scholars about Iranians of African descent, and that one of them talks about Baha'u'llah's important role in it, in emancipation in Iran.
Well, I know of one book about slavery in Iran by, what's her name? Behnaz Mirzai. I don't know of any books written by Baha'is. Of course, there's Mr. Afnan's book, which is very, very important because it preserves memories that would have been lost. I'd be very happy to see the books. Yes, Nader Saiedi is insisting that this tablet, Baha'u'llah, was written in Tehran after his father's passing. The research department in Haifa believes that it was written in Baghdad before Baha'u'llah's declaration, but after the Siyah, and certainly long after the Bab's declaration. I haven't seen any evidence one way or the other, so I can't really make a judgment. But in any case, Baha'u'llah's father was very, very wealthy and owned many slaves, of course. Baha'u'llah would have inherited these. It was customary in Muslim countries to free one's slaves, a person's slave, after their passing. So it's quite possible that Baha'u'llah's father's slaves were free. But free is a relative term. Now, where are they going to go exactly? It's not like they can go out and get a job. So even if they were freed, as Abdul Baha himself recognizes in a talk that he gave in America, that even though these slaves were technically free, they remained in the household of Baha'u'llah as servants because, well, I mean, we're dealing with an entirely different society, and you just can't go off and get a job in a factory. So they had no place else to go. Now, if I've given the impression that I'm apologizing for slavery, I'm not. I think the institution itself is oppressive and, of course, should have been abolished. But my focus is on the institution as an evil institution, as opposed to on the individual slave owners who may or may not have been evil. What we want to do is get rid of oppressive institutions. After slavery, of course, we have indentured servitude, we have racism, we have, institutionalized racism and so on. I mean, the oppression goes on, and it's a constant struggle against all forms of inequality and oppression, especially those based on race. The slavery in Iran was not based on race. There were white slaves coming from Russia and from Arabia, as well as there were black slaves coming from Africa. But nonetheless, it was just as oppressive. So now I sense that we're having a hard time with this. So why don't we hear from some more people?
Yeah, questions are open.
I have a question regarding language. You distinguish between slavery in the West and in the East. And granted, we're talking about slavery, but within that, I wonder if there's any language that distinguishes different types of servitude in the East during the time of the principles of the faith. And this is a terrible analogy, but as an example, where my mind is going is that in some cultures, there's multiple words for the word snow because of the conditions and the qualities. Would that help?
Very, very insightful and important question. Yes, the word slave, as it's used in the West, can't really be applied very precisely in Muslim countries. There were a number of words for slave. For instance, a woman who is a slave woman who has had a child by her master moves into an entirely different category. Now she's called Walad, which means the mother of the master's son. She cannot be sold. Her son is free. Her son will inherit, and so on. Even in the West, we had various forms of slavery which should have been acknowledged, including forced conscription into the army, including indentured servitude, which is also slavery for a particular length of time, if you live that long. There's apprenticeship, which was a kind of slavery where a young man usually, but sometimes women, would be apprenticed to somebody for until he was 20 or 25 sometimes, and so on and so forth. This unfree labor, which maybe we should call it that, is pretty widespread in society because people are always trying to figure out a way of getting people to work for free. For instance, we have a prison system now in the United States in which prisoners are really forced to work without pay, or with pay that is so small that it might as well be without pay. That is a form of slavery, really, if you want to look at it. And it's going on right now in the United States. So we have to, as Baha'is especially, take a broader, more universal view of oppressive systems and not focus so much on words, actually. I am even more concerned about the condition of women in 19th century Iran, all of whom could have been considered slaves, because they were not free to make their own decisions. They couldn't make decisions about employment, about marriage, about travel, nothing. I mean, you were in the household of a male relative, and you were entirely under his control. And that, of course, is what Tahereh rebelled against, you know, traveling without her male relatives and preaching to men and removing her veil and doing all kinds of outrageous things that eventually got her killed. So that is a broader understanding of unfree labor, let's call it.
Thank you.
How did it work with male slaves becoming eunuchs? I'm sure that wasn't something they volunteered for.
No, this is a horrible part of slavery in the East, at least, that in order to be suitable for domestic service, male slaves had to be castrated, so that there would be no question about you know, them producing children in the household and so on. And the chastity of the women would not be questioned. Now, normally this castration was done when the boy was a child. It was done in Africa. This is actually forbidden in Islam, but you know, they found people who would do it anyway. It was a horrible operation. Maybe 25 or 30% of the boys who were castrated would actually die of infection and so on, which made, of course, the ones who survived much more valuable on the market. And that's why they did it. So they could sell a castrated boy into a family for a very high price. Now, generally, these boys were brought into the family when they were children, and they remained there for the rest of their lives as the servants in the anderun, that is the women's quarters of the house. And the women were not supposed to come out of there unless accompanied by a relative or by one of these slaves who could care for them and protect them and attest to their chastity and all of these horrible things that, well, we still have horrible things, but in the past we can look at them and be horrified. But anyway.
It seems to me that women actually had it worse than the males.
In some ways they did, yes. But they could also be the owners of slaves, and some women could be quite wealthy and somewhat independent that way. But the women were under extreme oppression. They were, you know, respected and loved, we hope, within their own families, but they were extremely limited, as were poor men. I mean, you as a peasant, for instance, nobody had any money. There was no employment. You had to be dependent on your landlord for everything. Well, it's just, this is not a modern society where modernity has not yet touched Iran. And so we're dealing with a foreign country with different concepts.
People who had family, had business on their own, they would get their maid to help them at the business or shopping outside, because women were not supposed to go shop, and the male could not do it, had no time. They were normally used in different ways.
Yes. Well, middle-class women, respectable women were not supposed to go shopping or do anything outside of the household, frankly. But if you were a poor woman or a peasant woman or something, you could be running around the marketplace, but no respectable woman would be able to do that. And so you were under this restriction all your life. Now, unless this becomes a downer, guys, let's remember that the whole point of the Baha'i faith was to overturn this society and to bring freedom and equality to humanity, a humanity that didn't yet know it. What I'm saying is that the Baha'i histories that we know, for instance, Nabil's narrative, well, they were influenced and affected by this culture. And naturally, Nabil is not going to pay a great deal of attention to women or slaves in his history. And we can forgive Nabil for that because that's the world that he grew up in. However, I cannot forgive Baha'i historians today for doing the exact same thing. Now is the time to recognize that our history is broader than just what Nabil wrote, that there are Africans who were present at the very moment of the genesis of the Baha'i faith. And that's something we should celebrate and explore further. There was also a woman who witnessed the declaration of the Bab and was the point of pilgrimage and veneration by the Baha'is for decades afterwards. There was also an African woman who was there, who was also venerated by the Baha'is when they went on pilgrimage to the house of the Bab. And that is part of our history and something we should be very proud of and we should celebrate. As a matter of fact, when Khadijih Bagum died, she died prematurely, actually, of dysentery in Shiraz. Her servant, Fezzeh Khanum, died on the same day, also of dysentery. I suppose they ate something that was bad. But Baha'u'llah, when he received the news, reveals a tablet for Khadijih Bagum and also for Fezzeh, saying that they are both forgiven, and anybody who died on that day is forgiven by God and venerated as sort of like a saint or something. So that these people, the Africans, both Haji Mubarak and Fezzeh Khanum, have a very, very high station in the Baha'i faith, which has not really been fully recognized. Which is a happy thing, by the way. And we don't have to feel bad about it. We should feel quite good about it, actually. Okay, guys, I know there's more out there.
So apparently, there's a comment that was made. I'm going to read it off.
Please.
And I did not know about this, so I'm learning as we go. It says, in the late 1800s, Persians that were Shiites were sold into slave trade by raids of Sunnis and North Asian tribes, like the Tatars and the Turks in Khorasan, a province of Iran. Slave trades were not only Black Persians, but they were Persians, Koreans, Chinese, Indians who were sold into the slave trade in the late 1800s. And also, there's a large community of Persians in northern China that was taken as slaves in the period of the Mongol invasions.
Sure.
Interesting.
There's slavery is universal. There were slaves everywhere before the 19th century. And it's only in the 19th century when there was this sort of awakening in Western civilization that slavery was evil and unacceptable. People were sold back and forth as slaves. Women were sold back and forth into concubinage. It's a history which generally is not taught, but and peasants as was said before, maybe in times of famine and so on, were forced to sell their children into slavery to survive.
So I understand that modern day right now in Iran, because of the terrible situations that some people are in, that they're still committing this act where they are giving their children away so that they can have a better life to be fed as slaves. And it's appalling that this is today happening among people in that same country. So it doesn't seem, though it's illegal now, it doesn't seem that it's ended. It seems that it's only taken a new form.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can say the same thing about slavery in the United States. When slavery ended, after the Civil War, okay, we didn't have slavery, but we had systems of peonage and, prisoner forced labor, chain gangs, sharecropping where you were in debt slavery, and so on and so forth. There were various ways of exploiting Black labor, as there are today. I mentioned prisons. We have mass incarceration and the exploitation of prison labor. So it's never over, guys. We just have to continue to struggle again.
I like to add one more. In the absence of telephone, in Iran, they were used male servants as going asking other people how are they doing, if they are fine, or if they need something, or this family is going to visit them the next day. They were bringing news back and forth.
Yeah,
and
you can
really
see that in the Dawnbreakers with the Bob sending messages back and forth among the letters of the living. Mubarak was carrying these messages back and forth among the letters of the living. And obviously he was aware of what he was saying and knew exactly what was going on and was part of the inner circle of the Bob's followers. Now, obviously, because of the culture, he couldn't be designated as one of the letters of the living, but obviously also he was there and was participating in these conversations.
I'd like to make a quick comment if it's okay. The Bible in the Old Testament, the Jews were given instructions on how to handle their slaves. They had also eunuchs. They had all types of slaves. One of the interesting things that they mention in the Bible is the year of Jubilee. Now, the year of Jubilee was a time when all slaves were allowed to be freed, but they were allowed to stay with their, master, for lack of a better word. But then they would have their ear pierced so that they would be recognized as not a slave because they had to be, but a slave because they wanted to be. And this is during biblical times. This is during BC 1000, 1200, whatever, long before 1800 rolled around.
Oh,
and,
sure. And
that was for that time, seems like a most humane thing. The year of Jubilee, I think, happened once every 50 years, if I remember correctly. Yeah. And so it allowed for people who were enslaved to be freed if they wanted to be, or to stay with whomever they were with. But it was their choice. And so they were given recognition by piercing, I guess, their ear or something, that they were now free, but they were still with these people by their own choice. And I think that's very humane for that period in time, all things considered.
Well, yes, all of the revelations, Judaism and Islam, Christianity doesn't have much to say about it, but in Islam, slavery is also regulated, and it's encouraged that you free your slaves and so on and so forth.
Well, more specifically, Muhammad says that freeing a slave freeing any slave is the most meritorious of all acts that a Muslim can make. So it's the most meritorious act. And literally, without banning slavery, Muhammad's saying you shouldn't have slaves in Islam as well.
Yes, and then the slaves, through the Sharia and through Muslim law, slavery is regulated so that you should not mistreat your slaves and so on. But you'll notice that even though Muhammad highly praises the manumission of slaves and says this is the most meritorious of acts, that doesn't mean that everybody did it. I mean, that just means that they thought it might be a good idea. But there was always slavery in Islam and the buying and selling of slaves. For instance, it's forbidden in Islam to enslave Muslims, though it's not forbidden to enslave pagans. But when the Muslim slave traders went to Africa, there were Muslim tribes. Well, they just said, well, you know, those guys really aren't Muslims, and they just enslaved them anyway. So practice is different than law, of course, and the ideals are not always adhered to.
That's, I think, a very, very big lesson to take away, as it is applicable today as it was then.
Well, yeah, I mean, we have to recognize that our task, our job, our burden, our glory, our, you know, our distinction as Baha'is is this continuous struggle against oppression, against evil institutions, and for the unity of humanity and the equality of all people. I mean, Baha'u'llah makes this great call to humanity. O well-beloved ones, the tabernacle of unity hath been raised. Regard ye not one another as strangers. You're the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. That is such a remarkable call to humanity, which we have not yet lived up to, of seeing all humanity as one people and oppressing nobody. I mean, I can't even imagine at this point, but for the rest of our lives as Baha'is, that's the call. I mean, and for me as a historian, I see it as a call not only forward into the future, but also backwards into history, that we should rescue the humanity of people who were oppressed and whose humanity was denied, like slaves, for instance. So what my work has been in academia was to go back into the history of Iran and see how many slaves I can rescue from oblivion and tell their stories. And the Baha'i history has this rich history of Mubarak and Fezzeh, where because they were present in the household of the Bab, we know a great deal about them and can affirm their humanity in history and rescue them from, well, oblivion. We can't rescue them from oppression anymore, but at least we can honor their humanity. That's what I do anyway.
Those are very spiritual words.
Well, I hope so. I don't know. Anyway, if anyone is not familiar with Black Pearls, I'm happy to send an electronic copy to Jeremiah. Maybe he can get it to you, or you can email me. I, have other resources on slavery in Iran. Nader Saiedi's, I can't read, what does it say? Somebody put a chat up, but my eyesight is so poor I couldn't read. There are other resources that were made available. Nader Saiedi's paper on Mubarak, and also my paper where I'm, arguing for a wider Baha'i history that would admit these people into our sacred history.
I was the one that just put a note in the chat, and unfortunately you weren't able to read it because the print is unfortunately quite small. I was just trying to say it's a very beautiful and noble thing that you're doing, trying to rescue these people from non-recognition to being recognized. And I just hope that God blesses your efforts and your continued efforts in this cause. I think it is beautiful. So
thank
that's all
you.
I was trying to say.
Yeah, I feel very, very strongly, very passionately about these people who, during their lifetimes, and I'm not talking about Baha'is now, but during their lifetimes, these slaves who were, denied humanity and who were regarded as non-persons. And I want to reaffirm their humanity and turn them into real persons in history, even though they're dead. So that's what I do. And including in Baha'i history, by the way, Mubarak was there kind of at the door of the Bab's house as his Ethiopian servant, but he was kind of a non-person, in Baha'i history. He was, kind of the Ethiopian servant. He didn't even have a name. But now we can see him as a person. And even though our traditional histories didn't.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on that personhood as well, and the way that we know them as the Ethiopian servant, or the companion of Khadijih or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
We don't. Everyone else, as an English speaker reading the Dawnbreakers, everyone else has about 10 names. They have their name and the city they're from, and a title, and the title Baha'u'llah gave them, and the title, the title they were called something else, and these servants were also just given like Fezzeh, one name, and Mubarak is usually referred to as just the Ethiopian servant or Mubarak without even the Haji, which means that he went on the pilgrimage with the Bab. That's why he's Haji.
Yeah.
So I think it's really important to give them as many names as possible as well, because it's part of elevating their station to parity with
to personhood. Yes.
Yeah.
And no, that's quite right, and that's cultural. I mean, we understand that 19th century Iranian culture is not going to give honorific titles to women and slaves, but at the same time, we are now living in 21st century, and we can change that.
Mm-hmm. We have some Baha'i families from those people who were, African in Iran.
Yes, that's true. And many of these became Baha'is, and their descendants are still alive. Actually, I interviewed one. This is on another subject, but I'd written a paper on Fezzeh Khanum, who was the slave of a very wealthy merchant in Iran. She had a son by her slave who became a Baha'i, and here again is an example. He was supposed to inherit part of his father's wealth, but he was disinherited. Anyway, he went on pilgrimage. He saw Baha'u'llah. He went to India and did business, came back to Yazd as a very wealthy man, and so on. and his descendants are Baha'is and are still alive. Some of them live in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact.
And some in New York.
Yes, some in New York. There is Shahnaz Khorasani and her family, her daughter Elahe, and others. And they are, they're of African descent, and their great-grandmother. As many wealthy families in Iran are, because it was the wealthy families who owned the slaves, and it was the wealthy men who were having children by their slaves. And these children, hopefully, were inheriting their father's wealth and entering the upper classes of Iranian society because of the Sharia. Okay, guys, what else? If there's nothing else, we'll call it a day. That's a graduate seminar in Indian Ocean slavery, but what I was really interested in was Baha'i sacred history.
Yes, well, we, as you may see in the chat, there's been, and we had some actually tell you, there's been thanks for your hard work, and more importantly, this beautiful talk, and also questions about how to access your book. So the book that was just shown, The Black Pearl, can you please put it up again?
Oh, sure, of course. Unfortunately, this was published by Calumet Press, and unfortunately, it's currently not available, though I'm trying desperately to reprint it. But I do have an electronic copy, which I think I'll send it to Jeremiah, and you can, I think everybody's in touch with him, and you can get it from him. If not, you can email me directly. My email address is member1700, member1700 @gmail.com, member1700. And I will send you the electronic copy and you can read it that way. This is the memories of Mr. Adnan of all of the Black, well, the African servants and slaves who he remembers in the Adnan household. Mm-hmm. And it's an extremely important memoir, because no other Iranian in the country has ever written down his memories of the slaves in his family. It just never happened. And that's for cultural reasons again. And I believe Mr. Adnan is the only person who ever sat down and remembered these slaves in writing. And basically he was writing for the African Baha'is, but his book was published.
Thank you.
So that's another Baha'i contribution to Afro-Iranian history.
And better yet, as it's been made available to those of you who are watching on YouTube and Facebook after the fact, as well, or those of you who are here now on Zoom, please reach out on the clearwaterbaha'is.org website on the contact section, and we can get that book out to you. Jeremiah will be keeping an eye out. So
okay. Great. Somebody else put up a chat that I can't read.
Jackie Newberry, she said, "Thank you so much. I luckily have the book. I will read it."
Good.
So that being said, it is about time for us to get going. So again, we will be having this beautiful presentation online for those of you who joined in the middle or what have you, or those of you who haven't seen it yet. By all means, check out our library of videos on YouTube, Clearwater Baha'is, the YouTube channel, or on Facebook, the Baha'i Center of Clearwater. Thank you, everyone.
Well, thank you so much for this. This was great. I enjoyed it so much, and I'm so happy to meet you all.
And we look forward to having you visit.
Thank you very much.
God bless. Thank you.
Thank you.
Allow